In the late summer of 1885, on the short-grass high plains of eastern Colorado, a lean 27-year-old Norwegian-American farm wife named Lena Hartvig took a cutting knife to 40 acres of good-standing corn while it was still green and sweet in the ear, chopped it all down before a single frost, and buried it in 6 long earthen trenches dug into the south slope of her home quarter like so many open graves. The whole of Sorrel Creek Valley had already decided she had lost her senses. And by the time the men at the feed store in the little town of Halvard had finished laughing about it over their morning coffee, the valley had a name for her. They called her Sour Lena, and they laughed about it for 2 full years. Right up until the July the hail came down on the mesa like a cannonade out of heaven and beat every cornfield for 30 miles flat to the ground in 20 minutes, and the wet black autumn behind it molded every haystack in the county to rot. And by January the feed was dearer than beef, and the herds were starving down to hide and bone. Every herd but hers. She had not gone soft in the head. She had read a thing written down in a dead man's hand, in pencil, in a book of oilcloth covers, that not one of those laughing men had ever had the patience to read. This is the story of how she buried a crop alive and pulled a whole valley through a winter of famine on it, and of the men who came to her fence with their hats against their chests to learn how it was done. If you have ever kept faith with a thing your own people told you to throw away, if you have ever been the only one in the county still doing it the hard old way while everybody laughed, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you already understand Lena Hartvig better than those laughing men at Halvard ever did. So stay with her. Stay to the end. Because what those men were about to learn at the cost of their whole herds was already written down in pencil on the kitchen table of the woman they were laughing at. She was not a big woman. She stood maybe 5 feet and 5 inches in her worn work boots, lean as a fence post is lean, all long bone and hard tendon, with a single heavy braid of wheat pale hair that she wound up under a man's felt hat when the wind came off the mesa, which on that country was most days of the year. Her hands were the thing you noticed. They were a young woman's hands gone old before their time. Wind burned across the knuckles, the nails cut square and short. A white seam of an old scar across the left palm where a hay knife had once slipped. She wore a gray work dress faded near to the color of the buffalo grass, an apron of unbleached ticking over it, and in the wide front pocket of that apron, wrapped in a square of waxed cloth against the dust, she carried a book. It was not a Bible, though she had one of those too, on the shelf by the stove. This was a smaller, fatter thing, its covers made of black oilcloth that had cracked and gone gray at the corners, its pages swollen with damp and pressed flat again 100 times, and it was filled edge to edge, in a close crab pencil that was not her own, with numbers. Her husband had died of a burst appendix in the second winter on the place, before there was even a proper barn, and her father, the man whose hand had filled that book, had died the spring before she came west, back in the black soil country of central Illinois where she was raised. So she was alone on the quarter section, which is 160 acres of grass and plow ground on a fold of land above Sorrel Creek, with a milk string of 11 cows and their followers, a team of heavy horses, a mortgage held at the bank in the county seat, and a way of thinking about feed that the men of that country found first amusing and then, when she would not quit it, offensive. Because here is what everyone knew in the year 1885 on the high plains, about how a body was supposed to get a herd of cattle through a winter. You knew that corn was grain. You let it stand in the field until the ear went hard and dented and the whole plant dried the color of an old newspaper, and then you cut it and shocked it in the field. And you husked the ears off by hand and cribbed them dry, and the dry stalks you called fodder and fed as rough stuff. And you knew that hay was winter. You cut your wild hay off the bottoms in July when the grass was up, and you stacked it high and prayed it stayed dry, because wet hay heated and molded and could burn a barn down from the inside, and moldy hay killed stock. Those two things, dry corn and dry hay, were the whole science of wintering cattle, and they were as settled in a man's mind as the book of Genesis. Dry meant keeping, wet meant spoiling. Whatever was wet was rotting, and whatever rotted was death to an animal. Every man in that valley had watched a cow bloat and die on spoiled feed. They had it in their bones. And here came this thin widow woman with her dead father's pencil book, cutting her corn down 2 full months early, while it was still green and milky and full of sap and worth, by any reckoning any of them could make, 3 times what dried corn was worth, and cramming it green and wet into holes in the ground, and tramping it down with horses, and shoveling a foot of dirt over the top of it as if she were burying a horse that had died of the strangles. She was taking good feed and, in the plain sight of the whole country, spoiling it on purpose, rotting it, souring it. In a country where a single moldy stack could ruin you, she was manufacturing rot by the wagon load and telling them, in her flat, careful accent, that come January her cattle would eat it and grow fat. The feed store at Halvard was where the valley did its thinking out loud. It was a long, low building of unpainted plank down at the foot of the one street the town had, with sacked oats and cracked corn stacked to the rafters, and a cold stove in the middle of the floor that in summer served as a place to lean, and in winter as a place to spit near. The proprietor of it, and the biggest cattleman in that stretch of the valley besides, was a heavy, soft-spoken, patient man named Ambrose Pickett, and it was in his store, among his sacked feed, that the name got made. A neighbor had ridden past the Hartwig place and seen the trenches going in, 6 of them, 40 and 50 feet long, and the horses walking their slow circles over the chopped green corn, and he came into the store and told it as a joke. And the joke went around the cold stove and came back changed. "She is souring her whole corn crop," one of them said, burying it green like a dog buries a bone, and telling the McHenry boy that come the hard weather her cows will get drunk on it and thank her. That was the first the word drunk entered into it, and it stuck, because there was a rumor already going that a fermenting thing made spirits, and everyone in that store had seen a man the worse for spirits, and a picture of a barn full of staggering, sour-breathed cattle was too good a picture to let go of. Sour feed, sour milk to come, sour Lena. Ambrose Pickett himself did not make the name. That was always his way. He leaned on his own counter with his thumbs in his vest and let the younger men make it, and he smiled his slow smile, and he said only, when it had gone all around the stove, that it was a shame, a real shame, a woman alone out there with no man to tell her the truth of things, and that a quarter section that good, with that creek bottom water on it, ought not to be thrown away on foolishness. He said it kindly. He said it as a man says a thing he has decided is going to come to him in time, if he is only patient. And every man in the store heard the kindness, and not one of them heard the wanting underneath it. You could have stood in that store on any morning of those 2 years and heard the whole temper of the valley in 5 minutes. There was a morning early on, before the first pit was even sealed, when the talk got going hot around the cold stove. And it is worth setting down as it was spoken, because it is the mockery live and out of men's own mouths, and not a thing softened by the years. "I rode past her place yesterday," one of them said, "a lean, gap-toothed fellow who ran cows on the flats. She had them big Percherons walking circles down in a hole in the ground, in a hole on top of chopped-up green corn. I set my horse 10 minutes just to be sure of what I was seeing." "She is making sauerkraut for cows," said another, and the store laughed. "She is making whiskey for cows," said the first, and the store laughed harder. "You mark me now. Come Christmas she will pull the lid off one of them graves, and the whole herd will come out staggering, and she will have the only drunk cattle in the territory, and the only drunk cattle in the territory will be dead cattle by New Year's." "A woman alone," said a heavy older man by the door, not laughing, shaking his head slow. "That is the pity of it. Her man would never have let her. A woman gets a notion and there is nobody to say her no, and she runs it clean into the ground. Somebody ought to say something to her, for her own good." "You say something to her, then," the gap-toothed one said. "I said good morning to her at the mill and got a look off her like I had tracked mud on her floor. She does not want saying to. She wants a whole valley to admit she has outsmarted their grandfathers." And the whole store roared a third time, and that was the sound Lena Hartwig lived inside of for 2 years, the easy, grinding laughter of men who were entirely certain. And it never once occurred to a one of them that certainty and correctness are not the same animal, and that a man can be perfectly certain and perfectly wrong right up to the morning the ice comes down. Ambrose Pickett let that kind of talk run in his store and never stopped it and never quite joined it. He would stand behind his counter weighing out a sack of oats and let the laughter build. And now and again he would drop in a word, low and reasonable, that did more harm than all the loud ones together. "Now, boys, be fair to the woman," he would say. "It is not her fault. She has a French pamphlet and a dead man's scribbling and no husband to know better. And she believes it. She truly believes it. That is the sad part. She is going to lose that good quarter believing it." And the men would nod, sobered, agreeing that yes, it was sad, and not a man of them saw that the storekeeper had just told them, gently, that the quarter was going to change hands, and had a fair notion into whose. Lena Hartwig heard about the name as one hears about such things, second-hand, from the McHenry boy who hauled her a load of straw and would not meet her eye when he said it. She did not color up, nor did she argue. She counted out his money in silver, and she thanked him, and when he had gone, she stood a while at the edge of the first open trench, looking down into the packed green mass of it, already going warm and faintly sweet, sour to the nose, the heat of it rising into the cool of the evening. And then she took the oilcloth book out of her apron and turned to a page near the back and read a thing her father had written there, and she went in and lit the lamp and cooked her supper. She had known the name would come. Her father had warned her of it. There was a line in the book on the very first page that she had by heart. "Air is the thief," it read. And below it, in the same pencil, a second line. "They will laugh at the smell. Let them. The smell is the work being done." To understand where a notion that strange comes from, you have to go back east, and back a dozen years to a low white dairy farm on the black bottom ground of central Illinois, and to the man who filled that pencil book. His name was Anders Hartwig, and he was Lena's father, and he was, by the reckoning of his own neighbors, every bit as much a crank as she would later be called. He had come over from the fjord country as a young man, with nothing but a strong back and a head for figures, and he had built up a good milking herd on rented ground. And somewhere in his middle years he had gotten hold of an idea that would not leave him alone. The idea was that the ordinary way of wintering cows on dry fodder and dry hay threw away most of the good of the corn plant, and that a green plant cut in its milk and shut away from the air would keep sweet and alive and full of its summer worth clear through to spring. He had not invented the idea, no one man had, but he had gotten it from a book, and the book was a real book, and it is worth telling you what it was, because it is the hinge the whole of this story turns on. In the 1870s, a Frenchman by the name of Auguste Goffart had published, out of his own farm near Paris, a treatise on the keeping of green fodder in pits, buried and pressed clear of the air, and a few years after that an American dairy press had the thing translated into English and printed it up for the farmers of the eastern states, and it caused, in its small way, a war. Half the agricultural papers called it the salvation of the northern dairy. The other half called it a Frenchman's folly, a way to poison good cows with rot and call it science. Anders Hartwig read the translated Goffart 3 times through by lamplight, and then he did the only honest thing a man of figures can do with an idea. He tested it. He dug a pit. It was no great one that first year, only a trench the length of a wagon, and he lined it with plank and cut a few loads of green corn and packed it in and weighted it down with stone and a foot of earth. And all his neighbors came and looked and told him he had lost his mind. He kept notes. That is the thing to understand about the man and about the daughter who carried his book west. He kept notes as a scientist keeps notes, in pencil, dated, honest, the failures written down as plain as the successes, because a note that only records the wins is a lie and teaches nobody anything. He wrote the green weight he cut per square rod. He wrote the days it stood before he opened it. He wrote the depth the spoilage went at the top, and the exact place along the wall where an air pocket had let the rot creep in, and he wrote, in a hand that got surer with every season, the one law that governed all of it. Air is the thief, the first page said. Lena had read it 10,000 times. Pack out the air, and the green will keep. Leave the air in, and the green will rot. There is no third path. Everything else in this book is only the labor of getting the air out and keeping it out. He fed his first cured pit to his own milk cows in the February of a hard Illinois winter, with his neighbors standing by half, hoping to watch the animals fall down dead. And the cows put their noses in the sweet, sour green stuff and would not lift them again until it was gone, and they milked that month like it was June. He dug a bigger pit the next year. By the time Lena was a grown girl helping him tramp the corn, he was wintering 30 head on ensilage and selling more milk in January than any 2 dry-feeding men in his township. And the neighbors had stopped laughing, mostly, though they never did dig pits of their own, because it was hard work and strange, and their fathers had not done it. When he lay dying, the spring before Lena went west to join the husband who would himself be dead within 2 years, the last thing of any weight that he gave her was not money, and it was not the farm, which went to her brothers. It was the book. She remembered one evening with him above all the others, and it came back to her often in the hard years, the 2 of them at the rim of his best pit, in an Illinois twilight, when she was a girl of 12 or so, the frogs going in the low ground, her father with the book open on his knee. "Feel the top of it," he had said. And she had put her small hand flat on the earth cap and felt the faint, living warmth coming up through the soil. That is the pit working. Not rotting, working. There is a difference, and everything hangs on that difference, and no man who has not felt it under his hand will ever believe you. They will say, "Worm is rotting. Worm is dying." But you have felt it. You know. "How do you know when it is enough dirt, Papa?" she had asked. "How do you know the air is all out?" "You do not ever know for certain," he had said. "That is the hard truth, girl, and I shall not lie to you and say otherwise. You do the work as right as work can be done. You cut it short, you pack it hard, you seal it deep, you tread the cracks, and then you shut the door and you wait. And you find out in the winter whether you did it right. And if you did it wrong, the pit tells you, and you write down what it told you, and you do better the next year. There is no man alive who can promise you a pit will keep. There is only doing the work right and keeping honest notes and having the nerve to wait. Most men cannot do the last part. Most men open the door to see, and every time they open it, they let the thief back in. Patience, girl, the whole science comes down to patience, and patience is the one thing that cannot be bought or borrowed or hurried, and that is why so few will ever do this, and why the ones who do will always, in a hard year, have feed when the hasty men do not. She had not understood, at 12, how much of a life was folded into that little speech. She understood it, standing alone above her own 6 pits in Colorado, with the whole valley laughing better than she had ever wished to. Her father had not left her a method only. He had left her a way of bearing the waiting and the laughing and the not knowing, and it was that, more than any pencil figure, that carried her through the 2 years to the ice. "Take the book," he said. Those were near the last clear words he spoke to her. The land they will not give you. The book they cannot take. Everything is in the book. When they laugh at you, and they will laugh at you, girl, you go to the book and you do the next thing it says, and you do not argue with them, because you cannot win an argument with a man who has not done the work. You can only feed his cattle through a winter he cannot, and let him do his own arguing after that. So she took the book. And when the husband died and left her the raw quarter above Sorrel Creek and the mortgage and the 11 cows, and the first winter nearly broke her on bought hay at a price that made her weep over the ledger, she took the book out of her apron and read it through from the first page to the last, and in the spring she began to dig. The digging began in the last week of June, and it began where the book told her it must begin, which was not with the corn at all, but with the ground. She walked the home quarter with a spade and a length of knotted twine, and she found the south slope above the creek where the land fell away just enough to shed water, and the subsoil ran to a tight yellow clay, and there she laid out her pits. 6 trenches, the book said, was better than one great one, for a reason she came to bless before the story was over. 6 trenches meant that if the air got into one, she lost one, and not the whole of the winter. She dug them narrow and deep, only about 8 feet across at the top, and sloping in toward a narrow bottom, so the weight of the packed corn would press against itself and against the clay walls and drive the air up and out. She dug them running with the slope, so any water would drain and not stand. And she dug them that first year mostly with her own 2 hands and the team and a slip scraper, in the long light of the high plains evenings, after the milking, until the blisters on her palms broke and healed and broke again into the calluses of a working man. The corn she had planted thick, thicker than a man planting for grain would ever plant it, because she was not growing ears. She was growing tonnage of green plant, sap and leaf and soft milk stage ear all together. And she watched it as her father had taught her, not for the calendar, but for the kernel. She would walk into the rows in the cool of the morning and pull an ear and shuck it back and press her thumbnail into a kernel, and when the kernel spat a thin milk, she knew it was still too soon. And when it dented under her nail and the milk had gone to a soft dough, she knew the hour had come, and that the whole 40 acres had perhaps a week in it before the sugar in the stalk began to turn hard and dry, and the moment was lost for a year. That week was the pivot of her whole calendar. Everything had to be ready to fall on that week like a hammer. She had borrowed from a German family 2 valleys over who used it for their sorghum, a fodder cutter, a heavy iron thing of knives and gears bolted to a sledge that a horse on a sweep could drive, and it would take a whole cornstalk in at the mouth and throw it out the far side in short green chunks the length of a thumb. This was the second law of the book, after the law of the air. Cut it short, her father had set down. A long stalk will bridge and hold a pocket of air in its own hollow. A shortcut packs like wet sand and leaves the thief nowhere to hide. So when the kernels dented, she went out in the gray before dawn with a corn knife and began to cut. And the neighbor boys she had hired for the week came behind her and gathered the green stalks in their arms and fed them to the clattering cutter, and the cut green corn came off the machine in a wet, fragrant heap and was forked into the wagon and hauled to the pits. And the whole place smelled of cut grass and crushed sugar and horse, and then came the tramping, which was the part the valley never forgot, the part that made the name stick, the part a man would ride 2 miles out of his road to lean on his saddle horn and laugh at. Because to drive the air out of the packed corn, the book called for weight, steady and total and repeated. And the weight she had was horses. She led the team down a ramp of earth into the trench itself onto the bed of chopped green corn, and she walked them round and round, hour upon hour, in a slow, tight circle, their broad iron shoes treading the green mass down and down, while the boys forked in more, and she walked them again, and forked in more, and walked them again. Layer on packed, sweating layer, from the gray of the morning to the last light, for as many days running as it took to fill a pit to overflowing. Horses walking in circles in a hole in the ground, on a carpet of chopped corn, in a country where corn was money. It was the maddest-looking labor anyone in Sorrel Creek Valley had ever witnessed. And there was hardly a day of it that first September that Lena did not look up from the reins to find some man sitting his horse at the fence line, watching and grinning, and by evening the grin would be at the store, and by the next evening it would be a story. The first full day of tramping was the day the boy came close enough to talk. Charlie Pickett had watched from the fence for a week, and on the morning she led the team down into the first packed trench. He could not hold himself back any longer, and he rode down along the fence and got off and stood at the rail, and after a while, over the creak of harness and the wet crush of the corn underfoot, he called out, "Mrs. Hartvig, why do you walk them in a circle? Why not just drive a wagon over it, or drop stones on it, or leave it be? What does the walking do?" She did not stop the team. A body learns to talk and work at once out there, or a body does not eat. The walking presses out the air, she called back over the horses. Come down and see if you have the nerve for it. Your father will not like it, but come. And the boy came, down the earth ramp into the strange sunken world of the pit, onto the springy sweating carpet of chopped feed, and he walked beside her around and another. Feel it under your boots, she said. Feel how it gives. That give is air, trapped down in the green, and air is the thing that rots it. Every round we walk, the give goes out of it a little, and it packs tighter, like wet sand at the water's edge, and where there is no air, the rot cannot start. My father learned it over 20 years. He learned it by getting it wrong, by leaving air in and losing a whole pit to black slime, and he wrote down every way there is to get it wrong so that I would not have to lose the pits to learn it. That is what the book is. It is 20 years of a dead man's mistakes so that mine can be fewer. The boy walked a long time in the pit that day, saying little, and when he climbed out he was green to the knees and thoughtful, and did not ride straight home. My pa says it will all rot, he said at the rail, pulling on his gloves. He says you are throwing away good corn, and you will be sorry. Your pa may be right, Lena said, and she meant it, for she was an honest woman and the pits were not yet opened. We will know in January. That is the only honest answer I have for you, Charlie. We will know in January, and not one day before, and any man who tells you he knows sooner, your pa included, is telling you what he wishes and calling it what he knows. Come back in January. Whatever comes out of that pit, come and see it with your own eyes, and do not take my word or his. That is the whole of what I would teach you if I taught you nothing else. Go and see for yourself. Ambrose Pickett came himself once, that first fall. He rode up to the fence on a good sorrel gelding, in a good coat, and he sat and watched her walk the team over the corn for a long while without a word. And when she finally came up out of the pit leading the blowing horses, he touched his hat brim to her, courteous as a deacon. Neighborly of me to worry. I hope you'll take it, he said. But you are burying the one good corn crop in this valley, Mrs. Hartvig, and there are men who would give a good deal to buy that corn off you standing, dry it proper, and put money in your hand before the snow. I am one of them. I would go to 60 cents on the bushel, which is a charity price, and we both know it, for corn you are about to shovel dirt over. The corn is not for sale, Mr. Pickett, she told him. It is spoken for. Spoken for by who? By the cattle. In January. He looked down into the pit at the packed and sweating green, already ticking with its own heat, and a look crossed his heavy, pleasant face that she would remember later, a look of a man doing arithmetic behind his eyes. There will not be anything down there in January but rot and stink, he said gently, and when there is not, and the note comes due, you will remember I offered you a fair thing on a fair day, and that I am a patient man, and that this creek bottom of yours has always seemed to me a piece of ground that was meant to be watered stock, not wasted on holes. He touched his hat again and rode off, and there it was that Lena understood, clear and cold, that the man did not want to save her from her folly. He wanted her to fail of it. He wanted the ground. When a pit was packed as full as horses could pack it, heaped a good 3 feet above the level of the ground so it could settle, she sealed it, and the sealing was its own science out of the book. First a layer of wet straw, trodden down, to make a soft skin against the green. Then earth, a full foot of it and more, spaded up out of the next trench, and packed and rounded and smoothed so the rain would run off and not soak in. The earth is not to hold it down. Her father had written in the margin, next to a little pencil drawing of a rounded mound, The earth is to shut the door on the air. A pit that breathes is a pit that burns. Round the top so the water leaves, watch it settle, and where it cracks, tread the crack shut. For a crack is a mouth, and a thief comes in at the mouth. So through that first fall she watched her 6 long grave mounds settle and crack, and she went out morning and evening and trod the crack shut with her boot heel. And the country rode by and shook its heads, and the heat rose off the mounds in the cold mornings in a thin ghost of steam, and they called her Sour Lena, and she let them. There was a woman who did not laugh. Nora Pickett was Ambrose Pickett's wife, a spare, quiet, church-going woman who had buried 3 children in the little fenced graveyard on the rise behind the town, and raised the one son who lived. And she had a way of seeing a thing plain that her husband had long since trained himself out of. She came out to the Hartvig place in October with a basket, on the neighborly excuse of eggs. And she stood at the fence and looked a long while at the 6 mounds steaming against the cold, and at the thin woman trotting a crack shut with her heel, and she said what her husband would never say. "They are cruel about you in town, Mrs. Hartvig," she said. "I will not pretend you do not know it. My own husband is not the kindest of them, whatever face he wears out here. I came to say I do not think you are a fool. I do not know if you are right. But I have watched you work, and a fool does not work like that. A fool quits. You have not quit at anything I ever saw." "Thank you," Lena said, and she meant it down to the ground, because it was the first kind and honest word any grown person in that valley had spoken to her about the pits. "You may tell your husband, if he asks, that I have not quit, and that I do not intend to." "He will not ask me," Nora Pickett said. "But he watches you closer than any man in this valley, and I know why. And it is not neighborliness, and I am ashamed of it." And she left her eggs and went home, and Lena understood that she had, in that hard country, exactly one friend, and that the friend was married to her enemy. The son was called Charlie, and he was 15 that first fall, a long, thin, quiet boy with his mother's plain seeing eyes, and he took to riding the fence line above the Hartvig place on the excuse of hunting his father's strayed stock and sitting his pony there in the evenings watching her work, saying nothing. He did not laugh. He was too young to have hardened into the laughing, and old enough to be curious as the men had trained themselves not to be. Sometimes she would lift a hand to him across the field, and he would lift one back and then, embarrassed, rein around and be gone. She let him watch. A watcher who does not laugh, her father had noted somewhere in the book, is the beginning of the whole thing turning. Watch for the one who watches. And under all of it, under the digging and the cutting and the tramping and the sealing and the steady laughter of the valley, ran the arithmetic, which is the true engine of every farm story, whether the tellers know it or not. Lena kept her figures in the back of the oilcloth book, in her own hand now, under her father's. The mortgage on the quarter was $600 at 10%, which meant $60 a year to the county seat bank just to keep the ground under her, over and above what came due on the principal. The creamery at Halvard, which took the milk of 30 Valley farms and shipped its butter east on the new railroad, paid her by the pound of butterfat. And a milk cow that dried up or dropped her flesh in a hard winter paid nothing at all and ate money besides. The winter before, feeding bought hay at $11 the ton because her own wild hay had come up short. She had spent very near $90 to keep 11 cows alive from December to April, and they had come out of it thin and milked poor for months. The whole of her gamble came down to one line she had written and underlined twice. 40 acres in the pits, if the book was true, would winter 30 head fat on feed that cost her nothing but her own labor and a borrowed cutter. If the book was true. If the pits kept. If the air was truly shut out. And there was one way, and one way only, to know, and that was to open a pit and look. And she would not let herself open one until the deep of the winter, when the need was real, because the book was stern on that point too. Do not open the pit to satisfy your fear, ran the line in her father's hand. Every opening lets in the thief. Open it when the cattle are hungry and not one day before. Faith, girl, is leaving the door shut. There was a wisdom in the number 6 that the valley took 2 years to understand and that her father had bought with his own losses. One great pit he had written is a single wager on a single throw, and the man who makes it stakes his whole winter on getting one enormous ceiling perfect, which no man can promise. 6 smaller pits are 6 separate wagers, each one small enough to seal exactly right in a day, and if the thief slips into one, the loss is a 6th and not the whole, and the ruined one teaches you what you did wrong in time to do the others better. So she filled them one at a time, and sealed each the day she filled it, before she opened the next trench, and she treated each as its own small, careful world. And it was precisely this that saved her the spring the West Pit spoiled, for she lost a corner of 1 out of 6 and had 5 perfect, where a 1-pit gambler would have lost his all. The book had priced that lesson in a dead man's ruined winters years before, so that his daughter would pay for it in reading and not in starving cattle. That is what a good book of the old practical kind is. It is another person's disasters, set down honestly, offered to you for the small price of the humility to read them. And she opened them through the winters that followed the great one, on her father's stern rule, and never sooner, when the cattle were hungry and not a day before, and each opening was a small, held breath, the frozen cap cut away, the black sacrifice straw forked off, and then the moment of truth at the green face, the sniff that told her in one instant whether she had a pit of sweet-cured feed, or a wall of black rot, working or spoiled, kept or lost. It never stopped being a held breath, not in all her years. That is the last thing to understand about her, and about the method, and about the kind of nerve it took. She never once knew for certain, going in, what the pit had done in the dark. She only knew she had labored as right as she knew how, and kept honest notes, and shut the door, and waited, and then she cut the cap and found out with everyone else. The nerve was not in being sure. The nerve was in doing the work right, and bearing the not being sure all winter, every winter, with a whole valley waiting to laugh if the face came up black. It never did come up black again after the West Pit. She had read the one book that taught her why. The first opening came in mid-January of the first winter, and it came before witnesses, because the valley would not have believed a thing it did not see. Word had gone around that Sour Lena meant to open her graves and feed the rot to her cows, and a hard glee ran in the country about it, the glee of men who have predicted a disaster and mean to be present at it. So when she picked her morning, a still gray morning with the snow squeaking underfoot and the thermometer down near 0, there were a dozen of them at her fence, and Ambrose Pickett among them on his sorrel, and young Charlie beside his father, and 2 of the creamery men who had ridden out on purpose, and even a fellow with a notebook who wrote for the county paper. They had come to watch the cattle die. Lena did not send them away. "Come to the pit," she said. "Come right up to the pit. I will not have it told in town that I hid what came out of it." She took a spade to the end of the first mound, the one she had filled first and sealed best, and she cut away the frozen earth cap, and under it the trodden straw, black and matted. And a groan went through the men at the fence, because black is the color of rot, and they thought they had their disaster right there in the first foot. But under the black straw skin, which was the sacrifice layer, the part that always spoiled and that the book said to expect and throw away, the spade went into something else. It went into a firm, packed green-gold mass, cold from the winter but not frozen through, holding the shape of the trench, and out of the cut face of it rose a smell that stopped every joke in that crowd cold. It was not the smell of rot. Rot is a smell a farmer knows in his stomach, the sweet, sick reek of death. This was a sharp, clean, sour, sweet smell, the smell of a cider press, of pickled cabbage in a crock, of bread going, a living, fermented smell that made the mouth water before the mind could catch up to it. One of the creamery men said, later, that it smelled like the inside of a beer cellar, and that was the closest any of them came to the truth of it, because it was near cousin to the thing that happens in a beer cellar. A wild green pickling that turns sugar to acid, and the acid itself shuts the door on the rot. She forked out an armful of the stuff, green and glistening, and packed to the density of turf, and she carried it to the near pen, where 4 of her milk cows stood humped against the cold on their morning ration of poor dry hay, and she dropped it over the rail. And the barn went quiet, quiet as a church, because those 4 cows that had been picking without heart at gray hay came off the far rail at a shambling trot with their ears up and their nostrils working, and they buried their noses in that heap of sour green feed, and they ate. They ate the way a hungry man eats. They shoved each other for it. They licked the frozen ground where a wisp of it had fallen. And the lead cow, an old brindle that had milked on the place 3 years, lifted her dripping muzzle and looked at the fence full of silent men, and let out one long, satisfied bawl for more, and there was not a thing any man there could say to that. The fellow with the notebook wrote something down. The creamery men looked at each other, and Ambrose Pickett sat his sorrel a good while, his heavy face giving away nothing, and then he turned the horse without a word and rode home, and it was his silence, more than any cow's bawl, that told Lena she had frightened him. There was a night, that first winter, after the pit had been opened before the crowd and the cattle had bawled for more, and Ambrose Pickett had ridden home silent, when the thing came to a head between the storekeeper and his wife in their own kitchen, and one of the kind of scene the storemen never saw and would not have believed. Nora Pickett had watched her husband come in from that open pit with a face like a shut door, and she knew him well enough to read what the shutting meant, and she set his supper down and she did not sit. "You saw it same as I heard it told," she said. "Her cattle ate that feed like it was June grass and stood there fat, while yours are getting rough already, and it is not yet February. You saw it with your own eyes, Ambrose. I saw a parlor trick," he said, not looking up. "One pit opened for a crowd. Any fool can bring off one pit." "You do not believe that," Nora said. "I have been married to you 20 years, and I know the sound of you not believing your own mouth. You believe she has got hold of something. And instead of going to her like a neighbor and saying, 'Teach me,' you have set the whole town to laughing at her, and you have put out that it is a shame, and you have a barrel in mind already. Do not think I do not see it coming. You want her to fail so you can have that creek water. You would rather the whole valley learned nothing than that she be proved right and you be proved small. He put his fork down then, and he looked at her, and a long silence fell in that kitchen. "The creek quarter ought to be mine," he said at last. "Quiet. It ought to have been mine 10 years ago. It is the best water in this end of the county, and it is wasted on 11 cows and a widow's holes in the ground." "It is not wasted," Nora said. "It is feeding the only fat cattle in the valley, and you know it, and it is going to shame you before you are through, and I will not be able to say I did not tell you." And she went to bed and left his supper cooling, and Ambrose Pickett sat alone in his kitchen a long time, and the next week the barrel of rot went up before the store. He had heard her. He had understood her. And he had chosen the barrel anyway, which is the truest and saddest thing there is to say about the man. A laughing enemy is only a nuisance. It is when the enemy stops laughing that you had best look to your fences. Young Charlie was the last to leave the rail. He stayed after the men had strung out down the road, and he looked at the cattle eating and at the steaming pit, and he said, in the cracked, uncertain voice of a boy of 15, "How does it not rot, Mrs. Hartwig? Everything wet rots. My pa says so. How does it not rot?" "It is a long answer, Charlie," she said. "It is a whole book of an answer. But the short of it is that the wet is not the enemy. Air is the enemy. Take the air out, and the wet will keep. There is a thing that grows in it, a small, quiet thing you cannot see, that makes a sourness the way a crock of kraut goes sour, and the sourness is a wall that the rot cannot climb. My father wrote it all down. Come and read it some day, if your father will let you." The boy said nothing to that. But he came back to the fence the next evening, and the one after, and she saw that a seed of a thing had been planted in the one watcher who did not laugh, and she remembered her father's line, and she waited. Now, if this were a simpler story, the tale would end there, at the first open pit, with the cattle bawling for more and the men riding home shamed. But real vindication does not come quick or cheap. And the 2 full years the valley laughed were not one long joke. They were a slow tightening of a noose, and the worst of it came not from the laughing men, but from a man with a title and a printed report, and that is the part that nearly broke her. Because the trouble with a thing that works, but that no one understands, is that the men who cannot understand it do not simply admit they were wrong. They go looking for an authority to tell them they were right. And there was an authority to be had. The young state of Colorado kept a veterinary surgeon, a stock doctor with a state salary and a title before his name, whose business it was to ride the counties and inspect for the diseases that could sweep a territory clean of cattle in a season, and this man, whose name was Dr. Ottmar Renz, was, like a great many trained men of that day, dead set against the whole notion of buried feed. He had read the same arguing agricultural papers, and he had come down hard on the side that called it a Frenchman's poison, and when the creamery men carried word to the county seat that a widow up Sorrel Creek was feeding fermented corn to milk cows whose milk went into butter that people ate, Dr. Renz came out to have his look, and he came out already knowing what he meant to write. He was a stiff, cold, careful man in a black coat, and he stood over an open pit with a handkerchief pressed to his nose against the sour smell, and he would not taste the feed, and he would not watch the cattle eat it with any honest eye, and he asked Lena a great many questions in a tone that was not asking, but trapping. Was it not true that the feed was fermented? It was. Was fermentation not the very same process that made beer and whiskey? It was the same family of process, she said, but the sourness was an acid, not a spirit, and there was no strong drink to be had out of a silage pit any more than out of a crock of sauerkraut. He wrote in his book, given that the feed was, by her own word, sour, which is to say, acid. Would not a steady diet of acid rot the teeth in an animal's head and burn the lining of its stomach and taint the milk it gave? She said that her cattle had better teeth and better flesh, and gave more and richer milk than any dry-fed herd in the valley, and that he was welcome to open the mouth of any cow in the place and look. He did not open any mouths. He wrote in his book, and he rode away, and 6 weeks later the report came out, printed up on state letterhead, and posted at the feed store, and reprinted in the county paper, and it was a hanging document. It called ensilage a putrid ferment. It said the feeding of sour silage to dairy cattle was a reckless practice imported from the continent that would corrupt the milk, rot the dentition, and in time drunkard the beast upon the acid it imbibes. It used that word drunkard as a verb, and the valley loved it, and Sourlina was Sourlina twice over now, with the state veterinarian's name under it. And the creamery, which could not afford a whiff of scandal on its butter with the Eastern buyers, acted at once. The creamery manager rode out himself, a decent enough man caught in a bad place, and he told her, hat in hand, that the board had voted, and that the creamery would no longer receive what they were calling silage milk, and that until she went back to dry feeding, like a Christian her cans would be turned away at the platform. The creamery manager did not enjoy his errand, and it is only fair to him to render it as it happened, for he was not a cruel man, only a frightened one, and there is a difference. He found Lena at the loading platform with her 2 full cans, and he could not look at her while he said it. The board voted last night, he said. I argued against it, for what that is worth to you, which I know is nothing. But the Eastern buyers heard the state doctor's report, and they got a notion in their heads about tainted milk and sour butter, and the board is more afraid of the buyers than it is ashamed before you. We cannot take your cans, Mrs. Hartwig, not while you feed the silage. I am to tell you that if you go back to dry feeding, proper feeding, your milk is welcome the same as ever. Lena stood with her hand on the cold lid of a can that held the finest milk in the county, and she looked at the man until he had to look back at her. You have tasted my butter every fall at the fair, she said. Is it tainted? No, ma'am, he said. It is the best butter that comes to this platform. I have said so. Is my milk sour, or short, or thin? No, ma'am. It is the richest I take in. But you will turn my cans, she said, not angry, only laying it out plain so he would have to carry the shape of it home with him. Not because there is a thing wrong with what is in them, which you have just told me twice there is not, but because a man who never saw my cattle wrote a lie on state paper, and some men back east believed it. You may tell your board they have refused the best milk in the valley on the word of a man who would not open a cow's mouth, and you may tell them I will bring my cans back the day they ask, and I will not say a word about the seasons they turned me away, for I mean to be their neighbor a long time after this foolishness is forgotten. Good day to you. Mind you do not slip on the ice. And she loaded her cans back onto her own wagon and hauled the milk home and churned it herself, and the manager drove back to town with her words sitting on him like a stone. And he told his wife that night that he was ashamed of the whole business, and that the woman had more dignity turned away at the platform than the whole board had sitting in judgment, and that he did not think it would end as the board so confidently thought it would. That was the blow that landed. The mockery she could carry and had carried, but the creamery was her cash. Her $60 to the bank, her whole thin margin of survival, and with a stroke of a board's pen, it was gone. She stood at the platform with 2 full cans of the best milk in the county and watched the manager wave her off. And she hauled the milk home and made what butter she could in her own churn and sold it door to door and fed the skim to the hogs. And it was 1/3 of the money and twice the work. And that winter, the arithmetic in the back of the book stopped balancing. Ambrose Pickett, of course, had waited for exactly this. He was a patient man, he had said so himself, and now his patience was paying. He did not gloat out loud. That was not his manner. What he did was worse. He came out to her place on a soft spring day with a folded paper in his coat, and he was all sympathy, all neighborly sorrow at how the world had used her. And he laid the paper on her kitchen table and smoothed it flat with his heavy hand and offered to buy the quarter. He offered for 160 acres of good ground with Living Creek water on it, $400, which was not enough to clear the mortgage and leave her $1, which was an insult wearing the coat of a rescue. You would walk away clean, he said gently, so gently. No note over your head. A little money to start again somewhere a woman alone can make a go of it. I am doing you a kindness, Mrs. Hartwig, whatever the pride in you wants to call it. That doctor's report will follow this ground as long as you farm it. Sell it to a man they will do business with, and be free of it. And here's the thing the story must be honest about. Because a story that pretends the good are never tempted teaches nothing. She near took it. She sat at that table after he had gone, with the folded paper still on it and the lamp burning down, and she did the sums one more time, the milk gone, the report posted, the note coming due, 1 woman and 11 cows against a whole valley and the state of Colorado besides. And for the first time since her father died, she felt the bottom of her courage, and it was closer than she had ever let anyone see. That was the night she came the nearest she ever came to selling. She got out a pen. She unfolded his paper. And then she did not sign it. She put the pen down, and she took out the oilcloth book instead, and she turned past all her father's pages to the blank leaves at the back, and by the failing lamp she wrote down, in her own hand, cold and exact, everything the state doctor had gotten wrong, the acid that was not a spirit, the sound teeth, the rich milk, the fat flesh, so that whoever came after her would have the truth written next to the lie. Writing it down steadied her. It was as if her father sat across the table, and when she had written the last of it, she set down 1 line more, underlined, and it was neither a prayer nor a curse, but a decision. "Cut the corn again this year," she wrote. "Do the next thing the book says. Let the winter argue for you." And in the morning she carried Ambrose Pickett's unsigned paper out to the burn barrel and put a match to it, and she went and looked at her corn, which was knee-high and greening, and she began, for the 3rd summer, to get ready to bury it. The bank in the county seat was the other jaw of the trap, and it closed on her that same hard spring. The note on the quarter was held by a careful gray man, who had heard, as everyone had heard, that doctor's report and the story of the barrel, and when Lena rode in to arrange her yearly payment, he kept her standing at the rail of his desk and spoke to her as a man speaks to a debt he expects to have to collect the hard way. "I will be plain with you, Mrs. Hartwig," he said, folding his hands. "There is talk that you have lost your creamery contract. There is talk that your feed is under a state condemnation. A woman alone, no contract, a condemned feeding practice, a herd the whole county says will not see spring. From where I sit, that is a note in trouble, and I have depositors to answer to. Mr. Pickett has been in to see me. He has offered to take the note off my hands and the ground off yours, and I will tell you honestly that a banker sleeps better with that kind of offer in his drawer than with your promises in his book. Has my payment ever once been late? Lena asked. No, he admitted. It has not. Was it late the winter I bought hay at $11 the ton and went hungry myself to make it? No. Then you will take this year's the same as every year's, she said. And she counted the money out onto his desk, silver and paper, the full sum, scraped from door-to-door butter and hog money and going without. And you will tell Mr. Pickett, when next he comes in to buy my note over my head, that the woman pays her debts. And that a man who is so very sure my cattle will not see spring is welcome to wait for spring and see. It is not far off now. We will all of us know soon enough who was right. And she laid down the last coin and walked out, and the gray man counted it twice and wrote her a receipt and did not, in the end, sell her note. And he said later that it was not sentiment that stayed his hand, but the plain sight of a woman who paid in full in the worst year of her life, which is a thing a banker learns to respect more than any professor's bulletin. But the dark night was not done with her, because the book itself, that spring, handed her a hard lesson she had not asked for. When she opened the last of the first year's pits, the small one at the west end that she had filled last, and in a hurry as a squall came up, she found, along the whole north wall of it, a seam of black rot a hand deep, slimy and stinking, the real thing this time, the true putrid spoil, running the length of the pit where the packing had been rushed and an air pocket had bridged under a bad cut. Wad of long stalks. Half that pit was ruined. And the book had told her exactly why, in his pencil, before ever she dug it, rushed packing, long cut, the thief coming in at the wall. It was the one law she had let slip on a hurried evening, and the pit had kept the account and rendered the bill. Now, a spoiled corner in one pit out of 6 is a small thing to a farmer who understands it. It is the reason her father dug 6 and not 1. But Ambrose Pickett heard of it within the day, and Ambrose Pickett understood the value of a picture. He sent his hired men over with a barrel and had them fill it with the worst of that black slimy rot off the north wall. And he hauled the barrel to town and set it up on the loading dock in front of his own feed store, open to the air and the flies, with a shingle propped against it. And on the shingle he had painted the words that named her Feed the Poison of the Valley. And for a week that reeking barrel sat before the store, where every soul in the country came to trade, and men held their noses and laughed. And a picture of it, the actual stinking proof of it, did more against her than the doctor's whole report, because a man will forget a printed word, but he will not forget a smell. She had made the finest cured feed in the territory in 5 of her 6 pits, and the valley judged her on a barrel off the 6th. So she cut and buried her corn a 3rd time, in that 3rd summer, with the creamery still shut against her, and the barrel of shame not long off the store dock, and her hole standing in the valley at the bottom of the well, and she did it because the book said to, and because Winter, she trusted, would do the arguing that no word of hers ever could. She did not know, no soul in that country knew, that the winter she was cutting for was going to be the hardest that valley had seen in the memory of any living man. She only knew her own next task. Cut, chop, tramp, seal, tread the cracks shut. Wait, the corn came on well that third year, tall and heavy and green, and the whole valley's corn came on well beside it. For the spring rains had been kind, and the men who husked dry were promising themselves the best crib of ears in 10 seasons. Lena cut hers milk ripe as always, weeks before the ears would harden, and the neighbors shook their heads at the pale widow burying her fine green crop again, while their own stood tall and ripening toward a golden harvest. And if a man had ridden the length of Sorrel Creek that middle of July, he would have seen, on the one hand, 40 acres of stubble and 6 fresh mounded pits steaming faintly on her south slope, and on every other hand for 30 miles the finest standing corn in the history of the county, tasseled out, heavy, near to dent, worth a fortune in cribbed grain and winter fodder. And any man you asked would have told you which of them was the fool. The hail came on the 23rd of July, in the late afternoon, out of the southwest off the mesa. It did not come as an ordinary storm comes. The old people talked about it for the rest of their lives, and they all told it the same. First the heat went dead and green, and still the birds quit, the light turned the color of a bruise, a strange brass and lead color that a body feels in the teeth. Then the wall came over the mesa rim, a boiling blue-black cliff of cloud with a pale, churning underbelly, and it came fast, and it dragged a curtain of white haze beneath it that a man on high ground could see marching across the far fields like a thing alive, a hissing gray wall of falling ice. And behind that wall the standing corn was not there any more, and then it was on them. The first stones came down the size of peas, and then the size of hens' eggs, and then folks swore, some of them the size of a man's fist, driving in near horizontal on a wind that flattened what the ice had not yet broken, and the noise of it was not a patter and not a roar, but a hammering. A continuous splitting cannonade of ice on wood and sod and window glass, 20 solid minutes of a bombardment out of heaven that killed chickens where they stood, stripped the bark off the young cottonwoods, beat the gardens into the mud, and laid the whole valley's magnificent standing corn flat to the ground in ragged green ruin, stalks snapped and split and driven down, ears smashed, leaves shredded to green rags, 40 square miles of a fortune in grain beaten into wreckage in the time it takes to boil a kettle. And then it passed, and the sun came out on a changed world. There were drifts of hailstones a foot deep in the fence corners in the high heat of a July afternoon, white as January, steaming as they melted. The creek ran gray with ice and shredded leaf. And the corn, the whole valley's beautiful corn, lay flat and broken and already in the wet heat, beginning to do the only thing broken green corn can do in a warm field. It began to rot where it lay. Now here is the pivot of the whole story, and it is a real thing, and it is the thing not one man in that valley understood, and Lena Hartwig understood to the bottom of her bones, because it was written in the book in her father's hand under a line that read, plain as Scripture, hail is not the end of a green crop, only the end of a standing one. A field of corn beaten flat by hail is not destroyed. It is merely cut rough and early and by the sky instead of the knife, but cut. And green-cut corn, gathered quick before the field heat sours it and packed away from the air, will keep and cure into feed exactly as if a woman had cut it herself. The disaster that ruined every dry farming man in the valley was, to the one woman who buried her crop alive, simply an early and violent harvest. The hail had done her cutting for her. She did not sit down and weep over her own hailed stubble, for her 40 acres were already safe underground and had been for a week. She did the thing no one else in the county had the knowledge or the gall to do. She hitched her team the very next dawn, while her neighbors stood stunned in their flattened fields, cursing God and totting up their ruin, and she drove into the wreck of a neighbor's cornfield, the McHenry place first, whose good corn lay smashed and worthless to a dry feeding man, and she offered to buy the hailed corn where it lay, the whole flattened, ruined mess of it. For a few cents on ground, the man had already given up for lost. The McHenry family thought she had at last gone entirely mad, and took her money gladly, for what she was buying was, to their eyes, garbage, a field of green rot, and she and the boys she hired fell on that flattened corn with knives and a clattering cutter. Gathering the broken green stalks off the ground before the field heat could sour them, chopping them short, hauling them to 2 new pits she dug in a frenzy of labor along the old ones, tramping them down, sealing them under straw and earth. She salvaged, out of the county's disaster, more winter feed than her own 40 acres had given her. The hail that beggared the valley filled her pits to overflowing. The scene at the McHenry place the morning after the hail is one worth standing inside of, because it shows the whole gulf between knowing and not knowing better than any speech could. Lena drove her team up their lane in the wet dawn and found the man of the place standing in the ruin of his cornfield with his hat in his hand. Just standing, looking at 40 acres of the finest corn he had ever grown beaten flat into the mud, and he did not even turn when her wagon stopped. Gone, he said, to no one, to her, to the field. All of it. 2 days short of hard dent, and it is all just gone. I cannot tell you what I will winter on. I do not know what any of us is going to winter on. It is not gone, Lena said, down off the wagon, walking into the smashed green rows. Look at it. It is green yet. It is cut is all. The sky cut it 2 months early and rough. But it is cut green corn lying in a field, and I will give you $8 for the standing acres as they lie, right now, this morning, cash out of my hand. He looked at her then, and there was a kind of horror in his face, the horror of a beaten man being mocked, for that is what he took it for. You would buy this, he said. You would buy a hailed-out field of rot, to bury it in your holes. To bury it in my holes, she said, level, before the sun gets high and the field heat turns it. I am not mocking you. I am offering you $8 for a thing you were about to leave to the crows, and I am telling you plain that in January it will be feed, and your dry corn would not have been. And if you had a book like mine, you would be out here with a knife instead of your hat. But you do not. So I am. Yes or no? The heat is coming, and I have my own to gather. He took the $8. He thought her mad, and he took it gladly, and he told the story that winter, back at the store, of how Sour Lena had paid him good money for a ruined field, and the men laughed one more time, the last time, not knowing they were laughing at the one person in the county who had understood the storm. And when his own dry corn crib came up empty and his haystack came up black, it was that same $8 field cured sweet in her pits that she fed back to his cattle on shares and kept them alive. He never forgot it. He was the first man to say out loud, come spring, that he had been a fool. A few of the shrewder men saw her at it and understood, dimly and too late, that there might be something in the buried corn business after all, and one or two tried to copy her in the days after the storm, gathering their own haled corn and throwing it in hasty holes. But they had no book, and they had no years of her father's failures written down to warn them, and they cut it long and packed it loose and rushed the ceiling, and they left the door open for the thief. And by autumn their hurried pits were black stinking rot from wall to wall, which only proved to the valley all over again that the whole idea was poison, and that Sourlina's luck was luck and nothing more. They had done the thing without the knowledge, and the thing without the knowledge is not the thing at all. That is a truth worth carrying out of this story. The method is not the digging of the hole. The method is the book. Then came the second blow, the one that turned a bad year into a killing one, and it fell on the dry feeding men exactly where they lived. The men whose corn was ruined still had, they told themselves, their wild hay in the stack, and hay would carry stock through a winter as it always had. But the same wet that had bred the hail did not let up. That autumn came on soaked and black and sunless, rain and cold fog week after week, with never a drying wind, and the hay that had been stacked green and hopeful in that wet July never cured. It heated in the stack and molded, and a man who pulled the cap off his haystack in October found the inside of it gone to gray dust and black slime. Mow-burnt and rotten and worthless, the very rot they had all sworn Lena was making on purpose, made now by God and the weather in every honest dry stack in the valley. So the corn was gone, and the hay was gone, and winter, the hardest winter in living memory, came down on a valley with empty cribs and rotten stacks, and cattle to feed and nothing to feed them. The price of feed did what a price does when the thing is gone and the need is desperate. It climbed, and then it leaped, and then it went out of all reason. Hay that a man had grumbled to pay $11 a ton for now could not be got at 30, at 40, at any price a valley farmer could raise, hauled in by rail from counties that had escaped the hail, and sold by those who held it to those who had to have it. And the man who held that store, and thus held the sacked grain, and the freight arrangements, and the credit. The man who could set the price in that valley on the one commodity that now stood between every herd and death was Ambrose Pickett. He had prophesied ruin for her, and he had gotten ruin for everyone, and he meant to grow rich on it. He tripled his prices at the store, he called in the little debts, and he watched, with the patience that was the truest thing about him. As one hard-pressed neighbor after another came to see that the winter was going to take their cattle, and that a mortgaged quarter with a starving herd on it might have to be sold, at whatever price a patient man with feed and money cared to offer. And through that black, starving winter, the herds of Sorrel Creek Valley went down. It is a terrible thing to watch, and the old people who lived it never forgot it. The slow foundering of good cattle on rations that were not enough, the fat going first and then the flesh, the hip bones and the ribs and the knob spine rising up under the hide, the eyes going dull. The animals standing humped and shivering in the lots on a handful of moldy hay and a few costly ears lowing at the fences in a way that got into a body's sleep. Men who had jeered at the store 2 summers running were not laughing now. They were selling the family milk cow to buy hay for the beef stock, or selling the beef stock because they could not feed either, and taking pennies on the dollar for animals they had bred up over years, and some of them, the proud ones, the loud ones, watched their herds die in the lots rather than sell into a market Ambrose Pickett had rigged, and buried them in the drifts, and did their weeping where no one could see. And on the Hartvig place, above Sorrel Creek, on the south slope where the 6 old pits and the 2 new hail-filled ones lay under the snow, there was steam. That is the picture the whole story has been walking toward, and it deserves to be set down plain. Every morning of that killing winter, in the blue cold before the sun cleared the mesa, Lena Hartwig walked out to a pit with her fork, and she cut away the frozen cap. And she opened the sweet, sour green heart of the summer that she had buried alive, and the warmth of it, the living ferment still faintly working under the snow, rose off the cut face in a plume of steam that a man could see from the road, from the fence, from clear across the valley. Steam rising off the ground in January in a starving country. And she forked out the green feed, still smelling of cider and cut grass and the lost summer, and she carried it to her cattle. And her cattle were fat. That is the sum of it. In a valley of walking skeletons, on a place the state doctor had condemned behind a name that meant poison and folly, and a woman gone soft in the head, there stood the one fat, sleek, glossy. Contented herd for 30 miles in any direction, blowing steam of their own in the cold, their hides tight and shining, their bags full, calves coming strong in the spring lots, all of them wintered on the buried crop the whole county had laughed at. Every herd in the valley starved that winter, every herd but hers. It is worth slowing down inside that winter, for it was long. And its slowness was the whole of its cruelty. The cold came early and hard, and it did not break. Week after week, the mercury sat below zero, and the wind came off the mesa dry and knife-edged, and the snow did not melt, but only packed and drifted and packed again, and the cattle in the lots of Sorrel Creek stood into it with their tails to the wind and their backs humped and their ribs coming up. And the sound of them, the low, steady, mournful lowing of hungry stock, hung over the whole valley from the first light to the dark. A man could ride the length of the settlement and hear it the whole way, from every lot but one. The desperate came to her before the end. Pride is a warm weather crop, and it does not survive a killing winter, and one bitter afternoon a man she barely knew. A hard, proud settler from up the creek named Ostrand, who had been among the loudest at the store, rode into her yard on a gaunted horse with his hat already in his hand, which for that man was the same as a lesser man on his knees. Mrs. Hartwig, he said, and his voice was rough with more than the cold. I have got 40 head up the creek that are going to be dead by March. I have got children. I have got no hay a man can feed and no money to buy what there is. And Pickett wants a price for his that I cannot raise and would not pay a Christian if I could. I have got nothing to offer you but the truth, which is that I laughed at you with the rest, and I was a fool, and I am asking you, one neighbor to another, is there any of that feed to spare, on any terms a ruined man can meet? Lena looked at him a long moment, and there was nothing of triumph in her face, for triumph was never in her. I have got 6 pits and 2 more from the hail, and I have got more feed under this snow than my own string can eat before grass, she said. Bring your 40 head down and put them in my south lot. I will feed them on my silage through to grass, and you will pay me in labor come spring, help with the cutting and the tramping when the corn comes ripe. And we will call it square, and speak no more about who laughed. Bring them tomorrow. Do not let them stand another week getting weak, or the feed will not bring them back. Bring them tomorrow, Ostrand, and bring your boys, and I will show you how it is done while you are here. For you will want your own pits next fall, and there is no reason on this earth a man cannot dig his own. He could hardly speak to thank her. He brought his 40 head down the next morning, staggering and rough-coated, and she fed them beside her own on the buried summer, and by the time the grass came, they had flesh on them again, and not one was lost. And Ostrand dug 6 pits of his own the following fall, and never in his life let a man speak against her in his hearing. And that scene, with small changes, played more than once at her fence that winter, the proud man on the gaunt horse, the hat in the hand, the plain confession, the feed given without a word of reproach. She could have named her price. Pickett would have. She named labor and silence and the promise that they would learn to do it themselves, which is the only price a person of her kind ever wants. That the thing be learned and carried on and not merely bought. And all the while the steam rose off her pits in the blue mornings, and the whole valley could see it, and it said a thing no argument could say. "There is your poison," the steam said, rising warm off the buried summer, while your certain knowledge stands starving in the lots. "There is your folly, feeding 40 of Ostrand's head and a dozen of your own, and keeping them all in flesh while the wise men bury their dead in the drifts." The steam did the arguing her father had promised her the winter would do, and it argued in a language even the proudest man of them could not answer, the plain language of a fat cow in a famished valley, and one by one, that long winter, the men of Sorrel Creek fell silent before it, and the silence was the beginning of the end of all the laughing. There is a picture, and it belongs to the man who wanted her land. One gray afternoon, in the deep of that winter, Ambrose Pickett rode the fence line between his own ground and the Hartvig quarter, wrapped to the eyes against the cold, and he stopped his horse and looked across. On his side of the wire stood a lot of his own cattle, good beef stock he had bred with care, and they were poor, ribbed out, humped and dull on the costly hay he was hoarding to sell to his neighbors, worth more to him in his own lots as a lesson than as beef. And on the far side of that same wire, across the snow, the steam was rising off an open pit. And a thin woman in a man's hat was forking green feed to a bunch of cattle so fat and glossy and content they might have been a summer painting set down in the middle of a killing January. He sat his horse a long time. He did not speak, for there was no one to speak to, and there was nothing to say. A man can carry a false belief a long time, but he cannot argue with a fat cow in a starving country. He turned his horse and rode home, and whatever went on behind his heavy, quiet face he kept to himself, but he did not laugh any more, and he never laughed again. His son did not wait for him. That is the heart of the ending, and it happened without the father's leave. Young Charlie Pickett, 17 now, and grown lean and serious through the hard winter, had watched the steam rise off those pits all season from his father's side of the fence, and had done his own arithmetic, the plain arithmetic of a boy who has seen his father's cattle starve while the neighbors grow fat. And one bitter morning he saddled his pony before light and rode over to the Hartvig place and got down at the gate and took off his hat and held it against his chest. Lena came out from the barn and found him there, a boy standing bareheaded in the cold with his hat over his heart, and before she could speak, he said the thing he had come to say. "My father didn't send me," he said. "He doesn't know I'm here. I came on my own. I've watched your cattle all winter, ma'am, and I've watched ours, and I don't understand it, and I want to. I want you to teach me how it's done. I'll work for it. I'll dig, I'll cut, I'll tramp the corn, I'll do whatever the work is, only teach me. I don't ever want to stand in a lot and watch good animals starve when the knowing was right across the fence and I was too proud to cross and ask." And Lena Hartvig looked at the boy a long moment, the one who had never laughed, the watcher her father's book had told her to watch for, and something in her that 2 hard years had wound tight let go a little. "Put your hat on, Charlie, before your ears freeze," she said. "It is a long answer, and it is all in a book, and you may read every page of it. Come inside. We will start where it starts. The air is the robber of the pit, and everything after that is only the work of shutting him out." She did more than teach the boy. That is the part of the ending that puts her above the ordinary run of proved right people, and it is the part the narrator will not let you miss. She had it in her hand to let the valley starve its cattle and salt the ground with the neighbors who had mocked her, and no one would have blamed her, and yet she refused. When the worst of the winter closed in and the neighbors' cattle were foundering, she went to them, one hard-pressed family at a time, the McHenry family and others who had laughed loudest, and she offered to winter their starving stock on her pits on shares. "Feed my silage to your cows," she said. "Keep them alive till grass, and we will settle up fair in the spring." She wintered other men's cattle on the feed the state had condemned. She even sent word, through Nora Pickett, that she would take in a string of Ambrose Pickett's poorest cows on the same terms, no charge beyond the shares, and the proud man could not bring himself to send them, and could not quite bring himself to refuse. And in the end it was Charlie who drove a dozen of the worst of them over the hill by night, and Lena fed them, and they lived, and not one word was ever spoken about it between her and the father. She did not gloat. There is no scene in this story where Sourlena stands in the feed store and tells the men what they can do with the state doctor's report. The narrator will do that telling for her here once so that she never has to. She was right, and they were wrong, and they were wrong for 2 full years, out loud, in print, on a shingle over a barrel of rot. And when at last they were proved wrong, she fed their cattle. That is who she was. The public apology came in the spring, and it came where the mockery had been made. Being the one place an apology is worth anything. When the grass came at last, and the surviving cattle were turned out, and the counting up of the winter's losses began, the men drifted back to the feed store as they always had. Only they were quieter men now, poorer men, men who had buried good stock in the drifts, and the talk was not what it had been. It was the McHenry man, whose cattle Lena had wintered on shares and thereby saved, who said it out loud first, standing by the cold stove with his hat in his hands. He said he had been a fool. He said he had laughed at that woman for 2 years, and she had kept his cows alive when his own knowing had failed him, and that he was ashamed to his boots, and that any man in the valley who still had the word sour in his mouth for her had best swallow it or answer to him. And the store went quiet, and one by one the other men found some version of the same words, and even Ambrose Pickett, from behind his own counter, allowed in his slow, heavy voice that he had misjudged the thing and the woman both, which was as near to an apology as that man had it in him to come, and everyone present understood the size of it. But the word of a shamed neighbor, precious as it is, does not by itself change a country's mind. What changed the country's mind and the state's was the arrival of the one thing that can turn a folk's secret into public knowledge, which is a man with a title on the right side of it. The new agricultural college that the young state kept up at the north end at Fort Collins had among its men a professor of animal husbandry, a curious, open-minded fellow named Professor Emmett Thorne, who read the county papers and heard, through the veterinary office of all places, of a widow on Sorrel Creek, whose condemned herd had come through the killing winter fat, while every dry-fed herd in the region starved. And unlike the state's own doctor, Professor Thorne did the honest thing, which is the same thing Anders Hartwig had done 20 years before with a Frenchman's book. He went and looked, and he did not go to sneer. He wintered the next season at the Hartwig farm with a scale and a notebook of his own, and he weighed her cattle and tested her milk and studied the oilcloth book page by page. The failures and the successes both, and he opened her pits and put his own educated nose to the sweet sour steam of them, and he wrote it all down. And he published it. The station at Fort Collins put out a bulletin printed on the same kind of state letterhead that had once carried the doctor's poison and drunkard report, and this bulletin said the opposite. It described, in careful measured language, a system of preserving green fodder in earthen pits that had wintered a herd in prime flesh through the hardest season on record at a fraction of the cost of dry feeding, and it gave the weights and the milk records to prove it. And it named the cooperator whose farm and whose records had furnished the trial. It called them, in the dry official language of such things, the Prairie Pit Trials, and it credited the method and the meticulous notes to Anders Hartwig, late of Illinois, and to his daughter, and the dead father's name that had never been anything to anyone in Colorado went into the permanent record of a state institution, in print, where it remains. And Professor Thorne saw to one thing more, a small thing, a human thing. He arranged for a field day, a demonstration, where farmers from 3 counties could come and see the pits opened and hear the method explained, and he had the notice of it printed up and posted, and he had it nailed up at his own particular request. On the wall of the very feed store at Halvard, where that reeking barrel had once stood and the laughing had started. The county came to that field day by the wagon load. They stood at the edge of Sourlina's pits and breathed the sweet sour steam and heard a professor call it science, and they went home and got out their spades. The field day itself deserves telling, for it was the public turning, the day the folk secret became state knowledge in front of the very men who had named it poison. They came from 3 counties, as promised, wagons strung along the Sorrel Creek Road from before noon, and Professor Emmett Thorne stood at the head of an open pit in his town coat with a fork in his hand, which endeared him to every farmer present, and he did the thing the state's own doctor had refused to do. He put his hand into the feed, he lifted out a forkful of the cured green silage, steaming faintly in the spring air, and he held it up and smelled it, and before them all he ate a little of it, and then he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, "I was trained in the East, and I will tell you honestly that I was taught this could not be done. I was taught that wet feed is spoiled feed, and that fermentation and rot are one thing. I was taught wrong. What is in this pit is not rotten. It is pickled, preserved by its own acid, exactly as your wives preserve cabbage in a crock. And it has carried this herd through the hardest winter any man here can remember in flesh that any of you would be proud to sell. The science of why is only now being written down. But the practice of it, gentlemen, the practice was written down 20 years ago in a farmer's notebook, and this woman has been doing correctly, out here alone while you laughed. The very thing the colleges are only beginning to study." There was a silence over that crowd, the deep, uncomfortable silence of a great many men rearranging what they had been sure of. And then Professor Thorne said the thing that finished it. "I am going to publish this," he said. "I will publish it under the name of the man whose notebook it came from, an Illinois dairyman named Anders Hartwig, now dead, and under the name of his daughter." who proved it on this ground. And I mean to ask any man here who still has the word sour on his tongue for her to come up now and put his hand in this pit and eat what I have eaten, and then say it to my face. Not one man came up. And the notice of that field day, printed on state paper, was nailed to the feed store wall at Halvard, on the same planks where a barrel of rot had once stood. And it hung there, curling at the corners, for years. The creamery, of course, came back. A creamery follows the money and the milk. And when a state bulletin had made silage respectable, and the county fair had given the blue score for butter to the richest, yellowest, sweetest butter in the show, which came off the cows of the woman they had banned. The board reversed itself with all the dignity it could scrape together and welcomed her cans back to the platform, and no one said much about the 2 seasons they had turned her away. She did not remind them. She shipped her milk and took her check and wrote the figure into the rear leaves of the book, under the old columns in a hand grown sure with the years, and the arithmetic balanced now. And went on balancing. The next summer, 40 new pits were dug along Sorrel Creek. The summer after that, no man could have counted them. The German neighbors 2 valleys over that had lent her the fodder cutter built a proper upright silo of staved wood, the first in that end of the state, and within a decade the tall round silos stood beside the barns of the valley like grain elevators for cattle, and the earthen pits Lena had trodden closed under her own heel were the grandmothers of the whole lot. The thing that the whole county had named poison and folly and the work of a woman gone soft became, in the ordinary course of a few short years, simply how a sensible man wintered his stock. So ordinary and so obviously right that the young men who dug the silos could hardly believe there had ever been a time when their fathers laughed at it. That is how it always goes with a true thing. First they laugh, and then they fight it, and then they say they knew it all along. Charlie Pickett learned all of it, page by page, and he dug pits of his own. And when he was a grown man with a place of his own, he was known through that country as the best silage man in 3 counties. And he never once let a soul call the method anything but what it was. And he never told the story of the killing winter without telling the part where a boy bared his head at a gate. Nora Pickett and Lena Hartwig stayed friends to the end of their lives. Ambrose Pickett never got the creek bottom quarter. He lived long enough to see his own barns flanked with silos and to feed his own cattle on the very thing he had paraded in a barrel down Main Street. And if there is a lesson in a man like that, it is a quiet one, that the world will in time make a fool of every man who bets against the patient truth, and that the making of that fool is God's business and not ours, and comes without our lifting a hand. Lena never lifted a hand against him. She only fed her cattle and fed his and let the winter do the arguing, exactly as her father had told her at the last. And the book, that black oilcloth book of a dead Illinois dairyman's pencil figures, did the thing a true book is for. It got copied. Neighbor after neighbor came and sat at Lena's kitchen table and copied out the laws of it in their own hands, the green weight per rod, the short cut, the tramping order, the rounded earth cap, the sacrifice layer you expect to lose, and the first law over all the rest, that the air is the one thief and all the labor is only shutting him out. The knowledge spread from that one cracked book across a valley and beyond it, outliving the laughter, outliving the doctor's report, outliving sour Lena herself and the men who named her, which is the only kind of victory that was ever worth the winning. She did not get rich, nor did she get famous, nor, in the end, did she much care to. She got to be right, in front of the people who had told her she was a fool, and she got to feed the cattle of the men who had laughed, and she got her father's name written into the permanent record of a state, and she got the knowledge to live on past her. For a woman who came west with nothing but a book and 11 cows, that was enough. That was everything. Consider what the buried summer had actually bought, laid out plain, for the arithmetic is the marrow of it. Where a dry-feeding neighbor with 40 head had spent, in a normal winter, better than $100 on hay and cribbed corn, and come out in the spring with thin cattle and poor milk, Lena wintered near 70 head that killing year, her own and Ostrand's and a dozen of pickets smuggled over by night, on feed that had cost her the price of seed, a borrowed cutter, and her own hard labor. And no cash at all, and her cattle came out fat. In a winter when a ton of hay could not be had under $30, she fed for pennies. The men who had laughed had been laughing all along at a woman who had solved the single hardest and dearest problem of their whole way of life, and had solved it so completely that in the worst year in living memory she had feed to give away. That was the thing that Reeking Barrel had hidden from them for 2 years. That was the thing the steam finally told. The Kessler family 2 valleys over, the ones who had lent her the sledge-mounted cutter for her sorghum, were the first to move past the pits to the thing that came after. Their eldest, a broad, slow, careful young man who had helped her one cutting season and watched the whole business close, reasoned that if a buried trench kept grain corn by shutting out the air, then a tight round tower of staved wood above ground where a man need not shovel snow to reach his feed would keep it better and handier. And the next summers he built one. The first upright silo in that quarter of the state, a tall, staved cylinder that the neighbors gawked at as they had once gawked at the pits. And it worked as the pits had worked, on the same one law, and within a few short years the tall silos stood beside the barns up and down the valley, and the earthen trenches that a thin widow had trodden closed with her own heel were understood, by anyone who troubled to ask, to be the mothers of them all. Charlie Pickett grew into exactly the man that hatless morning at the gate had promised. He read the oilcloth book, cover to cover, copied it out in his own careful hand, dug his pits and later raised his silos, and became known through 3 counties as the surest silage man in the country. The one a worried neighbor rode to when a pit went wrong, and he never once in a long life let the method be spoken of as luck or as a woman's folly or as anything but what it was, a science his own people had been too proud to learn until a hard winter taught them. He kept his copied book on the shelf beside his Bible. And when he was an old man, and the young ones asked him how the whole silo business had ever gotten started in that country, he would tell them about the killing winter, and the fat cattle and the starving ones, and the steam rising off the pits, and he would always come, at the end, to the part he told best and cared about most, which was not the cattle at all, but a boy taking off his hat at a gate in the cold, and asking instead of laughing and being taught. There is one of these stories in every county in America if you know to look for it. The particulars change, the crank changes, the disaster changes, but the shape holds. The one stubborn soul who keeps faith with a true thing while the whole town laughs right up until the year the laughing stops. If ever you have been that one, or loved that one. Or simply mean to be the kind of person who crosses the fence and takes off the hat and asks to be taught rather than the kind who laughs by the cold stove, then this channel was built for you, and I would count it a kindness if you would subscribe and ride these back roads of the old hard country with us, story after story. And before you go, I will leave you the question this one leaves me. When the day comes, as it comes to everyone, that you are standing at a fence looking across at a thing you do not understand working better than your own sure knowledge ever did, will you be the father who sat his horse and rode home silent and never quite crossed over? Or will you be the son who got down at the gate in the cold and took off his hat and asked? Tell me in the comments. And stay warm out there and keep your own book and mind the thief.